Okay, home stretch. Thanks for hanging in there. You all really understand why I put that elephant, right? All right, so just keep in mind this is a framework. It's not something you do in one lesson. No one intends for you to run back and do all of this in a week or even in a month. But it's meant to inform, as you continue to think about this, ways that you can enhance your practice, to take away from this understanding that it's not just about the product. You have to think about the process of skill that allows for you to arrive at the product. There's a expression I think I shared with Tim this morning. Danielle McNamara talks about strategies, and I think strategies are critical. I mean, they provide students with scaffold. They provide steps for arriving at, the ability to express understanding. But strategies are not the end goal here, right? The end goal is the development of the processes and skills that allow for the student to automatically, right, make meaning as they read the words. So she says strategies are skills made automatic. That's something to be thinking about, right? So your strategies, your activities are always very targeted in terms of what contributed to comprehension do I need to address? And I wanted to say this. I don't include assessment in this workshop. It would just be, way too much, all right? But I have been working with educators in the past and have continued to think about what does informal classroom-based assessment look like in comprehension? How do I think about these contributors to comprehension? And how do I develop ways of observing my student, whether they're responding to me orally or they're creating a product expressively, that help me further target what their need is, right? So that when I'm intervening or providing intensive instruction, yes, I have this big picture in mind and I want them to be able to apply all these skills, but I also have a sense of where the breakdown is for them. And it may be in more than one area. And it's really their response to many of these strategies and activities, as I keep thinking about it, that provides that guidance for me, right? Is vocabulary the stumbling block? Is it background knowledge? Or where we're going in a moment, is it inference? Are they okay with the right there questions? They get those. But when I ask them to dig a little deeper. And so within my instruction then, if I start thinking about an emphasis, my emphasis has to be on those areas where they're still trying to develop those skills. While at the same time, overall, application, as I was just talking with Donetta about, that continual review that students need to keep their skills in place, to apply and generalize. So in the Blueprint for Comprehension book that I'm in the middle of writing, all right, I've tried to include in every chapter, each chapter is about one of these contributors, I've tried to include classroom-based observation and assessment activities at the end of all of those chapters. And I have to tell you again, they very often relate back to, all right, these activities and strategies that you're seeing in those roadmaps, all right? So I know that we have our screening measures, we have our progress monitoring measures, we have our outcome data, but they really we have our diagnostic tests of comprehension. They're just, I don't think, giving us enough information in terms of what we actually need to do in the classroom. We just haven't quite gotten there yet. So stay tuned. If I put that together, I'll share it out through the center and they can share it out with you guys. I just haven't put it all in one place. And this group of educators at AIM, and I've mentioned AIM a couple of times, I'm a public school person, but I ended up in my consulting life working with AIM Academy, which is outside Philly and is a school for dyslexic kids, right? I think we learn everywhere we go. And in many ways, all kids need the same thing, just some of them need more of it, more intensity, right? And so I've worked a lot with those educators in these areas, kind of thinking through, how do we make all of this sensible for our kids? How do we structure it so that all kids can access text in a meaningful way. And what are the strategies, activities, assessment tools that we can use? So it's a work in progress, everybody. We all are, right? So, okay. So let's go back to the chart, all right? Let's go back to activate and assess background knowledge, build background knowledge, and connect. And let's see what I added, all right? And I have a feeling, as you look at this, it's going to feel pretty familiar. I have a sense that your conversations were probably very much in line with what I have here. So here's just a few tools. Anticipation guides. How many of you have used an anticipation guide? Yeah, some of you. So I'm going to explain to you what an anticipation guide is. It can be used to activate and assess, see what it is that your students know about a particular text that they're reading, all right? And when I say text, it might be a one-page selection. It might be like The Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy, right? It might be a chapter in a book. It might be part of a textbook. So that's up to you. I mean, that's that flexibility. You know what your students have to handle, what the curriculum demands, all right? Also, questions and prompts. Here comes the question thing again, right? So providing prompts. So I'm going to show you some examples. Charts, webs, and maps. Many of you ask your students to represent, I'm sure, what they know in a web or in a map before they begin to read. And we just had a conversation something like this with Gabrielle, right? And then visual images, all right? So having them, and she was talking about, and some others were talking about visual images, drawings, and so on. Sometimes, I love that idea, sometimes students are better at presenting with a drawing than providing the language, because sometimes the language gets in the way. All right. The building background knowledge we'll go into as well, and you see some examples there. I'll return to that. And then connecting to background knowledge, and then you'll see some replication, because we can reuse, for instance, an anticipation guide. We activate with it, but then we revisit it. And we make certain that students make connections back to what we wanted them to learn from the particular text. All right. So, anticipation guides, all right? So the teacher prepares a series of written statements that may or may not reflect the critical content of the targeted text. In other words, there might be true and false statements, okay? Before students read, they indicate whether they agree or disagree with the statements, or they could say they're true or false. And after reading, they can compare their initial responses and discuss the differences. That's the last part, that's the connect. All right? Here's another example, all right? Teacher identifies pictures, photographs, illustrations, artwork from picture books, texts, or online resources, right? And we can use those to help activate. Coupled with targeted questions, they can support activation of relevant background knowledge from targeted text before and then during reading. Here's an example, the Declaration of Independence, okay? So here is an anticipation guide for something called the Founding of American Democracy. So this is like around 6th, 7th grade. This is, comes from commonlit.org. You can download it, free resources, right? And I've created an anticipation guide. Now the entire selection has to do with, you know, our founders coming back together and coming up with a compromise, because what they initially put in place after the Revolutionary War wasn't really working all that well, right? So within the text, there's information about why the revolution occurred. There's information about the Constitutional Convention. There's information about the compromise. So the British king had imposed unfair law and taxes without representation. Either they agree or disagree. Either they know that or they don't know that. You know, somewhere in their background knowledge, they have this sense of, oh, that's right, we had that American Revolution because they weren't treating us, the colonists, very fairly. Okay, American colonists were in favor of a strong central government. That's background knowledge as well. So here we have the connection between English language arts and history, what's happening in social studies. The Articles of Confederation created a government that worked well. The Founding Fathers were a group of men who played key roles in America's independence and new government. Founding Fathers met to write a constitution that created our democracy. And the Constitution created the judicial, legislative, and executive branches of government. So anything that they know, they surface. Again, middle school. So they've had some experience or interaction with this in their classrooms. You return to this after the reading, right? And after the reading, what they do is go back and review their responses and then talk about what they've learned from the reading. So this is the activate, assess, and then this is also the connections. All right. So those are two examples from the first column. All right, how about the building of background knowledge? All right, well, here's a couple of examples for that. Multiple topical theme texts. Well, I think we've been talking about that quite a bit today. So no doubt, if I read all of those texts that I put up early this morning about revolutionaries, I have a pretty good understanding of activism, revolutionaries, because I've read Benjamin Banneker, I've read The Life of Rosa Parks, I've read something about Dolores Huerta, right? So I have a pretty good understanding. So themed texts, right? Virtual and real-time experiences, and someone talked about that when we went around the room. Authentic artifacts. And then vocabulary connections. So here's the connection between background knowledge and vocabulary. And so even the use of words, all right? Even the use of words just on cards or on a whiteboard. What do these words mean? How are they connected? What do they make you think about? All right? Can you predict what we might be reading about based on these words? All right. So let's take a look. So again, description. All right, and we're pretty familiar with this. Educators identify topical theme texts. They read varied narrative and informational texts across curriculum that reflect critical topics and enduring understandings. And this is the example I just gave you. To develop an understanding of the critical topic, revolutionaries, there's a couple of the texts that they might read. How about authentic artifacts? All right, and you know, we used to go on a lot of field trips. You're probably not going on as many field trips as you used to. We can take virtual field trips, can't we? Educators exhibit and discuss authentic items that connect to the content, such as pictures, maps, music, writings, and related items. And I think I heard some of you share this as well. I think the idea of music is kind of cool, don't you? As kids love, they love music. All right. So to support an understanding about the life of Rosa Parks, for instance, if that's what we're reading, and the Montgomery bus boycott, students might study and discuss the meaning behind these artifacts. A photo of people seated on a segregated bus, the Rosa Parks arrest record, how about her fingerprint record, and maybe a photo of the boycott. And there are some authentic artifacts. You know, these things are pretty downloadable. If you go to the Library of Congress, the National Archives, there's so much available to us, particularly when it pertains to history, all right? And so you see, you know, you can take a look at that picture and you can say to your students, what do you notice about this picture? What do you notice about the people on the bus? Why do you think certain people are sitting in the back of that bus, right? And a little bit more mature student would know about Jim Crow laws, right? But maybe not this grade level, right? But having this conversation. And then explaining, there's yet another picture, I'm not sure I included it, of Rosa Parks sitting on the bus by herself, right? Well, there she is on the bus by herself. What do you think happened after that, if that wasn't allowed? Oh, maybe she got arrested. Guess what? She did. Look at the arrest record and her fingerprints. How do you think that made her feel? Why did she persist in doing this? Remember what an activist is? So there's all sorts of ways to make these connections prior to the reading. Okay. And then last but not least, what we can do is we can return to this connecting to background knowledge. And sometimes what we do is we just use the same strategies or activities that we used before. So anticipation guides, questions, prompts, we can fill in the chart or the map, you know, or the web. And then we can also talk about other readings. What else have we read about this? And how does this connect to? And what are the similarities between these characters, for instance? All right? So I thought I'd just give you an example of now, this is the anticipation guide, but it's just reformatted a little bit, and it's got to be for, agree, and disagree. And now it has an after agree or disagree. And then that can lead to a discussion, right? And someone mentioned having discussion and having conversation with your students, and I think that's particularly important. So I think, you know, we live in the world of multimedia. We need to use multimedia. So we need to use everything that's available to us, but not for days. We don't do background knowledge for 4 days running. We can do it up front, then we can do it as we read, and then we can return to it after we read. And it has to be very targeted in terms of what is it that you want students to walk away with? What are those big ideas? What are the enduring understandings? You might have more than one. Oftentimes when I work with teachers, I talk about, okay, here's the critical topic. So it's revolutionaries, right? Here's the enduring understanding, and it's that they can teach us life lessons. And here's some of the essential questions that might go along with this. And so some of the essential questions relate to how you design the background knowledge piece, okay? All right. So it's a quick connect again, and I've just shared some of my examples. Before we went to break, you shared some of yours. I want you to go back to your chart and see if you want to add something, all right? Go back to your chart and see if you want to script in a note, a takeaway for yourself. Okay, so when we think about background knowledge, okay, I think one of the things that we want to surface is those readers who possess high levels of knowledge, whether it's passage, general, vocabulary, they consistently exhibit better comprehension and retention than readers with low levels of knowledge. So I started off by saying this is getting a lot of attention, all right? And I want you to leave with this idea that this is really, really critical, right? And even though for a couple of years there was a lot of controversy about this because too much attention was paid, don't neglect this, right? Because what's the goal here in terms of reading? It's learning. It's learning, right? So we learn how to read and then we read how to, or we learn how to read and then we read to learn. So don't lose that, okay? So here's another true-false for you. I gave you this answer earlier today. Okay. So background knowledge is necessary for making inferences. Everybody, true or false?
True.
Yeah, this is a truth. It's not a fib. Correct. Very nice. You got the right answer. All right. So I wanted to use that as a segue into talking to you about levels of understanding and inference. All right. I like going back and connecting. We began by talking about students have to be able to read the words, make meaning of the words. They have to be able to work out that syntactic construction or the grammar of sentences, what sentences mean. They have to tie up the meaning, integrate. They have to incorporate background knowledge in order for them to build a mental model, in order to walk away with overall understanding. So this almost the last levels of understanding and inference ask these questions. How will you teach students to construct meaning at different levels of understanding, including the surface code, the text base, and the mental model of text? How will you directly teach students to use inference to integrate ideas and connect background knowledge to the text? How will you support your students' deep comprehension of text? Now, if you're looking at your blueprint, the wording on your blueprint is a little different than this. And that's because I keep changing. Because as I read and as I write and as I listen to professionals such as yourself, and I mull this over, I keep trying to make this clearer and clearer for everyone, including myself, right? So I did change the wording a little bit. Now note that I'm referencing back to that infographic. Remember Kayla was up in the corner and there was some books in the other corner. And then we had these levels of language processing, including vocabulary, all right, and then we moved to sentence comprehension, and we moved to text knowledge, and so on, all right? And down below it said surface code, text base, and mental model. Well, our levels of understanding, and we could talk Bloom's taxonomy, and we could talk literal and inferential, but our levels of understanding basically come back to this. Can we make sense of what the author actually wrote? That's the surface code. That's the exact words and syntax, AKA grammar, used in the text. So some of you may use, is it QRI? Right there, the information's right there. So that's really what surface level is. I can go find, I can read, and I can come up with the evidence I can directly find, right? Another level is text-based level. Well, what's that all about? That's about the fact that the author, if he or she actually wrote everything that was in her mind or his mind, we'd be reading thousands and thousands of pages, right? They can't say everything. They assume that the reader's going to bring knowledge. So it's what's implied in the text. It's like right below the surface, right? And for those of you who use, it's not QRI, I'm using the wrong, what is it? You know, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? Right there between me and the author. Darn, it's not QRI, that's qualitative reading inventory. Well, it's a reading approach, all right? That's on and off had popularity. This text base is really about, it's between me and the author. I kind of have to use the author's words and kind of surface what I know. So that's the text base. Inference is all about the text base, right? But inference also has much to do with the mental model. And again, that mental model, big picture, enduring understandings, it's what you take with you. It's the next time you read about revolutionaries, you take your understanding of the situation that was presented in one particular scenario to this next situation. It allows for more application of understanding, right? And so it's really where we want to go. It's this deeper understanding of text. Okay. So here's some examples of questions. And let's just think quick response. Let's think about the level of understanding they tap into. And by the way, they're in order. So this is not too hard. I knew it would be at the end of the day. All right. So what did Benjamin Banneker accomplish? Now, I know you didn't read this, but if you did, all right, and you saw some examples of sentences, guess what? The text told you exactly what he accomplished. He wrote an almanac, right? He was an astronomer. He was a surveyor. Okay. Surface code. Literal understanding. Why was Benjamin Banneker exceptional in his time? Well, the book didn't tell me that. The book told me all about the things he did. What did I have to bring to that text? And I had a slide that talked a little bit about this. What did I have to bring to that text to actually be able to respond to that question? My background knowledge. I needed to understand the time in which he lived and what life was like for an African American. Okay? Why are both Benjamin Banneker and Rosa Parks considered revolutionaries? Guess what? That's a mental model question. That's taking away this kind of big idea, understanding what their lives were like, understanding that they both gave us some life lessons, right? That's maybe a fine distinction for you, but I think it's an important one for us to keep thinking about, that as we move students along a continuum of understanding, that we have to not just be asking them those literal questions or making assumptions about what they can and cannot do. And again, I can use myself as an example because I was in a regular ed classroom for a while and then as a special educator, and I made a lot of assumptions about what text my students could or could not handle and the kinds of questions I asked them. So they can't learn to respond to deeper comprehension questions unless we give them opportunity and support them in doing that. Okay. So the texts give us lots of contributions. Text can't be understood without contributions from the readers. So remember, this is a dynamic interaction that's occurring. The texts provide instructions to the reader about how to use relevant knowledge and experience to build an understanding, but the building of understanding really depends heavily on the reader's ability to make inference. Okay. So now, here comes the question again. Inference is the identification of meaningful relations between. Well, do you think it's between various parts of the text? Do you think it's between those parts and background knowledge, or do you think it's both? Now, you don't have to shout it out loud if you don't want. You can say it, I heard you, though, you're right. You can say it quietly to yourself, all right? Because this is kind of a hard question. All right, here goes. You should have raised your hand, right? It's both. Now, usually when I ask teachers, what's inference? Usually, well, what do you think the typical response is? What immediately comes to mind?
In text.
Inference happens in text, okay? What else do you think? A lot of times teachers will say, it's filling in the blanks. It's filling in the gaps, right? And yes, it is that. And in fact, gap-filling inferences are inferences in which you connect to your background knowledge. But the reality is, the literature tells us it's more than that. And it includes what I talked about earlier, all right? That it's the identification of meaningful relations between various parts of the text. That's that local coherence inference stuff I was talking to you about, where you have to connect up the meaning within between sentences using cohesive ties. And we don't usually think about that as a form of inferencing at all. But Kate Kane and her colleagues say that's a necessary inference, right? And it's also connecting between the parts that the author provided us with and the background knowledge. Now we're gonna focus on the background knowledge one, right, for the rest of the day. But just so we know, it's a little bit more than what we typically think. So why is this so important? Well, we've laid a little bit of groundwork here. It's an important predictor of current and later reading comprehension skills. So that's one reason it's important. A major difference between shallow and a deep level of comprehension has to do with inferences. So whether or not your students go deep is dependent upon can they make inference. And it's necessary to create those coherent models of understanding. You're just not going to be able to understand all of what the author wants you to take away unless you have background knowledge. Okay. Now, what are some of the things that help, that facilitate, all right, this making of inference? And there are a number of factors that can either support or interfere with the ability to make inference. And I could talk about many more, but three potential ones are access to vocabulary and knowledge. That makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. Another one is working memory. So think about all of the things that a student has coming in that they have to sort through, that they have to hold on the working memory table as they attempt to make meaning of the words, the sentences put together, incorporating the background knowledge, and so on. One of the reasons we're talking about these language processes and skills is because we want them to be automatic for students. Remember I said something about strategies or skills made automatic? Yeah. So we want to be developing these processes and skills so that students are, and it's a different usage of the word, they're fluent, they're automatic at accessing. Also, the student's standard of coherence. Now remember what I said about coherence, how well the text hangs together and makes sense? All right. Dependent upon what the student sets as their purpose for reading, what they understand the purpose for reading to be, they may set different standards for themselves as they read through text. It's important for us to clarify for them what the intent is of the reading so that they can match up what they do with that reading based on what the expectation is. Okay. Poor comprehenders, probably the kiddos that many of us know. They're less likely to engage in the necessary processing. I think Kate Kane told us that too, right? They generate fewer correct inferences. They generate the same number but different quality. They may not access their background knowledge. I want to talk about that. I've mentioned that already. They may have the necessary background knowledge, but they don't come up with it. So we have to be thinking about strategies or activities that prompt them to do that, and I'm going to share one with you, all right? And they create these less coherent representations. Okay, so we're going to put to the side, I think you even have a slide on this, local coherence inferencing, all right? That's that integration within and between sentences, put it to the side, and we're going to talk about the kind of inferencing that you're most familiar with, and that's called global coherence. Again, you don't need to remember that term, but it's gap filling. So just take a moment and read the explanation in each of the boxes for the kind of inference that you more typically think of. Okay, so these are knowledge-based, all right? You know, oftentimes I think about, we make inferences all the time, right? I was in an airport, obviously, yesterday. Did you ever sit in an airport and kind of make inferences about the people around you? Right? Yeah, you use all the visual clues, and then you integrate your background knowledge, and you come up with this hypothesis about everyone sitting around you. So, our inferences are based on what we carry with us, our accumulation of knowledge, facts, experiences, even our attitudes and beliefs, and so are our students. All right. In the classroom, this is what readers typically use inferencing for, and oftentimes when I ask groups about inferences, they'll say prediction, right? That seems to be the most, we use inferencing to predict. And you know what, that's an important thing, but the reality is inferences more often than not in our minds, as we read through text, are used for understanding the cause of events, connecting up events, and kind of digging out why that happened, rather than predicting. But predicting's a nice way to get someone engaged in text, right? Oftentimes we'll use it for that. So what do readers do? They use it to understand the cause of events. They use it to predict future actions, and that's based on your knowledge, right? They use it to identify setting. You know, sometimes the author doesn't provide us with the exact setting in a narrative text, but instead what they do is describe the setting. Have any of you read Tuck Everlasting? Yeah, so Tuck Everlasting, you get what the setting is, but there's a big description of that setting, which is the forest, before it actually gets named. And I think it's called Tree Gap Forest, before it actually gets named, right? Okay, so as the student works through the text, they're kind of continually kind of making these educated guesses. That's almost what an inference is, right? An educated guess. They use it to understand characters' relationships. Yeah. Same book, Tuck Everlasting, you know? Why did that family want to be immortal? Because it's about immortality, of drinking from a spring that makes you immortal. Right? Why didn't they want the rest of the world to know about it? Okay. Their reactions, their actions were based on what was their relationship, and I've forgotten the name of the young girl that they actually kidnapped and loved living with them in the forest. Okay. We also use inference to draw conclusions and to understand the author's view or bias. And when we read history, history can be biased, right? Yeah. So we have to understand where that person is coming from. All right. So I thought I'd give you just a couple of examples of how we use inference. And some of you may have used that little picture book, Frog Goes to Dinner. I mentioned it earlier. It's a really lovely little book to use with a kindergarten class or first graders maybe. And so drawing conclusions. So I could use pictures to draw conclusions, right? I could even go back to some of those pictures from the life of Rosa Parks and make some inference. Maybe about how some of those individuals were feeling on that bus. Okay. So who do you think brought the frog to dinner and why? See the picture? Who do y'all think brought that frog to dinner?
The little boy.
The little boy. Why do you think the little boy brought the frog to dinner?
Got caught.
He got caught, or he's afraid he's going to get caught, and that frog popped out. You know what? He put the frog in his pocket. He didn't expect the frog to pop out and go on the tray. And so now there's the frog up on the tray, and he's like, oh, I've just better hide because they're going to figure out it's me, right? How do we know that? All right? That comes from our background knowledge. It comes from our experiences. All right. Identifying setting. All right. Some of you read The One and Only Ivan? Yeah. It's a lovely book. I mean, such a good book. 4th, 5th grade, kind of critical topics about animals and how animals are treated. Animals have feelings too. That's a unit that I've seen. All right. So The One and Only Ivan. So he's a gorilla, by the way. All right. I live here because I'm too much gorilla and not enough human. Needs a period, sorry. My domain is made of thick glass, rusty metal, and rough cement. Stella's, an elephant, is made of metal bars. The sun bear's domain is made of wood. The parrot's is made of mesh. So there's setting being described, but what is the setting? What do you think the setting is? Some of you read the book, so you know, but what's the setting? It's a zoo. It's a zoo of some kind, right? How do you know? Well, you know what zoos look like. You know that animals are generally caged or have specific domains in a zoo. This happens to be not a very nice zoo. It's one in a mall, right? And so this zoo, all right, is not one that you probably would want to visit yourself, and you feel pretty badly for Ivan. Okay. Here's cause, right? Understanding cause. And really understanding cause is sort of number one for inference, all right? Take a moment and just read. This is from that Stalin, A Brutal Legacy uncovered that I mentioned early on that Lily had to read along with Animal Farm and along with In the Time of Butterflies, Democracy versus Dictatorship. Okay. Now you get some clues from this, right? You get some clues. He's pretty brutal. But what else do you know about Stalin? Well, he murdered thousands and thousands of people, right? I mean, he not only ruled with an iron fist, he was incredibly cruel, right? And actually, these words, A Brutal Legacy, uncovered by Mike Kubik, he actually quotes Khrushchev, and Khrushchev talks about how horrible this man was. He had a terrible upbringing, he had a terrible father, but then he went on to imprison people, exile people, and murder people. So what's the cause of his being fearful? Well, pretty good one. Okay. So our background knowledge is really pretty critical in terms of going a little bit beyond now what the author actually has told us. Now, big surprise, right? What do the strategies and activities look like? Well, questioning. Now, you've seen me put that up more than once today, right? And I'll tell you that the National Reading Panel, when it proposed different comprehension strategies that were most effective, talked about the importance of questioning, answering, and asking questions. So this kind of weaves through the whole blueprint, doesn't it? Questioning. Visual and textual clues. So pointing out to our students and providing them with some prompts that are visual, that allow them to go back into the text and use the text, right? Graphic organizers. Think alouds. And while I talked about explicit instruction early on this morning, and I've referenced the importance of modeling and thinking aloud, I want to say that again now, that when you think about explicit instruction, it is structured, it is scaffolded, but it includes that I do, we do, you do. And oftentimes, the I do part is the modeling, right? And then we do, we practice together, and then you do, you independently apply. Think alouds play an important part in comprehension. And combination combos. So reading and listening, because some of our students listen, right, require the reader to make inferences that depend on prior knowledge, not on decontextualized inferencing skill. Now, I put that there purposefully, all right? And again, I'll talk a little bit about being guilty of not having enough knowledge at some point where some of my instructional strategies were just a bit lacking, right? So I remember using workbooks for a lot of things. Vocabulary workbooks. I'm not saying they're awful, but that's not really the most effective way to directly, explicitly teach vocabulary, right? They're good for practice, right? I also remember teaching other kinds of skills in workbooks, decontextualized, away from the text that the kids were actually reading. And the way that I read this is, if we're going to teach our kids these skills, yes, we can pull out exemplars, yes, we can pull out sections of passage, but we should be using what we expect them to read. That's really what they need to be practicing on. And yes, we need to provide lots of scaffolding for that. There's no doubt about that. Okay. So I just wanted to give you, again, an example, all right, in which we can prompt inference making. So I've described teacher behavior and I've described student behavior. So the teacher identifies and prepares the text. It might be a picture or it might be a text. So you identify what you want to use and then you prepare the text by thinking through where do you want your students to make inference, and maybe you're using a picture. And then you frame your inferential questions or prompts, right? I'll give you an example in a moment. And then you model the identification of clues and the integration of background knowledge. So you do that kind of thinking aloud, right? And then you model your response to whatever that inferential question was and why you've arrived there. And then what you see on the right-hand side is what is expected of the students. So now here's what I want you to do. Read the text. Here's the questions. I want you to think about these questions and prompts. Now go look for the clues and think about how you can connect those to background knowledge. Now respond to the questions. So here's the picture of Rosa Parks, and she's on the bus, right? And she's the only one on the bus along, well, not the only one. There are two people on the bus. There's a gentleman sitting behind her, and she's sitting in front of this gentleman. And so here comes the framing. These pictures were taken on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama. They're connected to the story of Rosa Parks. We're going to read about that story. We've been reading about that story. Remember, that's all about the Montgomery bus boycott. What do you notice about the passengers on the first bus? Who's sitting in the rear of the bus? And so you can do the think aloud, right, for students. Wow, Rosa Parks is sitting in front of this guy. What do I know about that boycott? I thought she was supposed to be in the back of the bus. What's going on here? Why, first of all, why aren't there any other people on the bus? Something must be going on. Oh, maybe this is about the boycott. But also, look at her sitting in the front of the bus, right? Why is she sitting there? Well, she's protesting. She's taking part in the boycott. So framing the question and then kind of working your way through and modeling the identification of the clues. In the first picture, and so you saw that first picture earlier, the people in the back of the bus are all African American. I know that they had segregation laws in the South in the 1950s. African Americans didn't have the same rights as white people. For example, they had to sit behind. But in this second picture, she's sitting in front of him. I think she's doing this purposefully and protesting a law that she does not feel is fair. I think she must have been protesting for her civil rights. So thinking about how you can begin to take some of the critical questions, the essential questions, and frame some answers by modeling for your students and just using some steps. Okay. This is a scaffolded organizer, all right? So this is really based off of, I think it's down in the lower left-hand corner, but if not, I really need to put what it's adapted from. But these scaffolded organizers have been around for a while, and most recently, Elbro and his colleagues wrote about the fact that students oftentimes have the knowledge, but they don't surface the knowledge. And so they started thinking about how they could scaffold questions to prompt that knowledge and help students make connection to text. They're not the first to do something like that, but certainly gave me some thought about, so suppose you use some visuals. This is sort of a combo platter. Suppose you use some visuals and then you use some questions or prompts that took students back to text, and then you ask them to come up with their inference. So here's my question. So again, you've modeled this, but here's the question I'm posing. Why do you think Benjamin Banneker wrote to Thomas Jefferson? It's an inferential question. That's not in the text, right? Right? I mean, you know he's writing to him about slavery, but why did he pick him? Right? Well, here's what it says. So you've got the little visual of the book. This actually comes from the book, right? So it says Jefferson signed the Declaration of Independence. Most black men and women were enslaved in the late 1700s. Jefferson owned slaves, and Banneker was an abolitionist. So I'm making a direct connection to what the book told me, right? But now I have to make a connection to what I know. Oh, here's what I know. He was a free man and the son of a slave. He accomplished many things. I know all of that. Others like him had very little opportunity. Jefferson, with others, had written the words, all men, and the rest of it, are created equal. So here's what I think. Here's my inference. So I've got a little visual here. This is what's going on in my head. Banneker knew slavery was wrong. He was angry about the injustice. He felt he must do something about it. He knew Jefferson was powerful, had fought for independence, thought he might listen to him. Jefferson was in a position to do something. Of course, he didn't, but he was in a position. So using this kind of an organizer where you're prompting, you're giving them the question, but then you're going back and using the words in the text, and then you're saying, well, what do you know about that, all right? And then making their inference oftentimes will allow for students who don't always surface their background knowledge to do just that. Of course, if they don't have the knowledge, you have to build it. Okay. So here's a scaffolded organizer, and we do have enough time for you to do this. Why was the discovery of this mummy so important? That's my question to you. And I want you to work in partners or pairs, right? And I want you to use the selection. And you may have to dig into it a little bit more deeply than the first couple of paragraphs, but probably not too far, all right? So don't spend a lot of time on it. See what it says, surface what you know, and then come up with an inference for that question. So my question, why was the discovery of this mummy so important? Here's what it tells me in the book. Here's what I know about this. So this is what I think. This is my inference about it. So take a few minutes to read, review, kind of skim, and then work with a partner. Okay, swing around and talk to the person or people behind you about what you think about this and what you were able to take from a very quick read and a combo of your knowledge. So swing around. Just do some sharing on this and the use of this organizer.
So that's what the...
Okay, any thoughts or inferences that you all made? Let me come back here. What inference did you all make, any one of you at this table? What was your inference? Why was the discovery of the mummy so important?
It's a woman in a male-dominated society.
Oh, okay, right here. It was a woman in a male-dominated society. That's it, right? Woo-hoo. Sorry, guys. That's enough. That's really good for the end of the day. All right. So this is just, again, when you think about inference, this is kind of hard to wrap your head around, and there's not a lot out there that gives us direct feedback on how to go about this, all right? So that's why I summarized it in that way with, the visuals, the graphic organizers, the combo, the questioning, and so on. There are some strategies for making inference. I think the Sims model strategy, instructional model out of University of Kansas has a strategy that you can use as well. Okay. So again, I'm all about reflection, right? So when we think about our instruction and we're self-reflective, we think about being informed educators. That's how we started this morning, this desire to continue to grow and to be able to reflect on our practice. When we get to this strand of the rope, when we get to this part of the blueprint, there's a really heavy focus on inference. So how will I explain this type of inference? How will I explain the importance of using background knowledge? Which text examples will I use are most relevant to my students' needs? What strategies and activities will I use to engage students in acquiring and applying skills? And are there manipulatives, gestures, visuals that could support or scaffold my student understanding? Okay. So when we look at the blueprint once again, this very last contributor, which is really expression of understanding, has everything to do with what we've been building throughout, the building of process and skill, so that ultimately students can express understanding. That's the product piece. And it isn't that they aren't producing product throughout, right? And again, remember the arrows mean these things are interrelated, just as the strands of the rope are interrelated. So what strategies and activities will you use to have students demonstrate understanding at different levels of understanding during and after reading? In other words, what are your products going to look like? What are you going to ask your students to do? And you have to differentiate, dependent upon your students, And certainly we want them responding orally, we want them responding in writing, but sometimes they can respond through drawing, right? Through art as well. So we have to be thinking about different methods or media that we can use for them to express their understanding. When I have lots of time, I like to talk about writing here, right? Because, there's been any number of research studies as well as reports about this connection between writing and reading comprehension. The Carnegie Foundation, the Alliance for Excellent Education comes to mind, Steve Graham's meta-analysis. There's just no doubt that getting students to write about what they're reading about improves their reading comprehension, right? And Tim Shanahan talks a lot about, and I think as you look at those different contributors, a lot about this kind of shared variance between reading comprehension and writing. Just think a little bit about writing. They have to use their vocabulary, precise words. They have to use different sentence structures to express meaning in different ways. They have to tie those up with cohesive ties, right? They have to use different text structures, discourse structures, paragraph structures, for instance, or story grammar, dependent upon what their purpose is in expressing understanding, right? They have to have built for themselves this background knowledge in order to write about something. I mean, you all know how hard it is to write about something. It's more difficult than reading comprehension, right? And they have to be able to say things in a way that the reader understands, and yet they can't say everything. So they have to be thinking about who their reader is and what their purpose is. So there's lots of shared variance here, and I think it's important, and I said to you a little bit earlier, asking teachers, what is it that you're writing about? And I remember really thinking a lot about that, and I actually asked someone before I gave those teachers my response, you should write about what you're learning about. I asked my sister, who for years was a first and second grade teacher. And I said to her, what do you have your students write about? And she looked at me like I had 14 heads, right? And she said, what do you mean? I have them write about what they're learning about. And that just makes so much sense, doesn't it? All right, last but not least, that arrow going up and down, the comprehension monitoring arrow. I just want us to not forget about the fact that we sometimes need to explicitly teach our students how to monitor their comprehension. We need to teach them when there are glitches in their comprehension that they need to let us know, right? So the skilled reader automatically prepares and plans for learning, monitors understanding, and assesses their plan. Proficient readers routinely ask themselves if they understand what they're reading. Think about yourself, when you're reading, right? But these kids who struggle don't necessarily do that. So they need to hear us do it, right? They need to hear it through think-alouds. They need to be explicitly taught, well, what do I do when I come to a word I don't know? Well, maybe the context will tell me the word meaning. Maybe morphology is. Maybe I need to use my online dictionary, right? Maybe I need to put my hand up and ask a question. Maybe I need to talk to my partner. So we need to be teaching kiddos as they monitor their understanding of word sentences and underlying meaning of the text. They may encounter some glitches and they need to activate varied strategies, and they need to be taught how to do that. The skilled educator models self-questions and the use of strategies to address potential glitches. As we're teaching, we sometimes do that. I always think about the fact that we are metacognitive. The effective, efficient teacher is metacognitive. We're always monitoring, right, what it is that we're saying. Today, hopefully I read your expressions. I tried to monitor your understanding. I'm sure you were monitoring your own understanding. And the hope is that when glitches occurred, all right, you either asked a partner or you dug into your background knowledge, or you're all going to send me an email and say, what the heck were you talking about when you talked about that particular topic? So be always thinking about your current practices. You all came into the room with rich experiences, background, commitment to students. The hope always is that when you leave a workshop, you leave with an enhanced mental model. That I've said something today, or you've talked with one another about something that will allow for you to do what? Kick it up a notch to make your instruction even more effective. So pack up, plan, and promise. Think about, all right, what ideas resonated or were most meaningful with you today. So remember the elephant, you don't have to do it all. Think about what you do want to do. Think about what information squared with your beliefs or current practices. I sometimes cause a little cognitive dissonance as I speak, all right? When I talked about decodable texts this morning, I thought, oh, I know this is a group that really understands foundational reading skills, and I love decodable texts, but they have a purpose. All texts have a purpose. Here's the other thing as you're leaving, sorry to throw this in. Level texts were really not designed to teach comprehension. They're really designed, I know I'm getting myself in trouble, I'm sorry. They're really designed to help students, work with words and see words over and over again, kind of predictability, patterns, to recognize patterns. They're not really that focused on comprehension. You have to know what the purpose of the text is. So I'm not saying don't use your level text, because maybe that's what you have to do, all right? Although maybe you want to supplement in terms of decodable, but anyway. But please think about using age and grade appropriate text with your students so that you build these language comprehension capabilities. And then what changes to comprehension instruction are you considering, and what questions do you still have? These are just some recommended readings. Oh, I didn't put my email there. I don't have the Natalie Wexler book on there, I don't think. I have to add that, because I think that's worthwhile if you're interested in knowledge. So her name is Natalie Wexler. You can look on Amazon for her.
Do you have any recommendations for vocabulary specifically?
I like Michael Graves' book. He has a new book out, second or third edition. It's Graves. That's probably the one that I've gone to most recently. Andy Biemiller, Biemiller, good books. Isabel Beck, Beck. So what you see up here is this book. I mentioned briefly Noni Lasso's name this morning. She's at Harvard. She works with ELL students. She talks about cultivating knowledge and building language for ELL students, but it's particularly relevant for all students, I think. Reading for Understanding, that's the RAND Reading Study Group report. It's a little old now, but it really was a seminal work after National Reading Panel and taking a look at what is reading comprehension and what should we be doing about it. LETRS, Digging for Meaning, that's Module 6. I co-authored that with Louisa Moats. That sort of started me on this journey. That book up top, The Children's Comprehension Problems in Oral and Written Language, is a good book, but it's a little heavy. I really love the book next to it, Understanding and Teaching Reading Comprehension, a Handbook. That's a great little book, very teacher-friendly. And then Multisensory Teaching of Basic Language Skills, Birch and Carricker's book, wonderful, wonderful chapters in that book on structured literacy. And then this is an oldie but goodie, The Voice of Evidence in Reading Research. So those are just a few recommendations. So I want to thank you. I'll put my email up here if anybody has questions or you want to send me comments or ideas. I welcome it all. And thanks so much for being really a great audience. You all just hung in there. Woo!